We will now call the meeting of the Waco City Council, special City Council meeting on January 10th, 2022 to order at 1 p.m. Please join me for a moment of silence. Thank you. We provide an opportunity for the public to address the City Council on any agenda item or during the hearing of visitors portion of the agenda. On items other than public hearings, speakers will be allotted 1 3-minute presentation regardless of the number of agenda items the speaker wishes to address. If you are here to speak and have not filled out a registration card, please see the City Secretary staff at the registration table outside of the auditorium to provide registration information so that staff can contact you if necessary. If you have handouts, please let us know at the beginning of your presentation and staff will distribute these to council. If you're unable to approach the podium due to physical limitations, a microphone is able to be brought to you. Is there anyone present who would like to speak on a work session item today? If not, then we will move to the next item of the agenda, which is work session item 2022-001. Bradley, would you please introduce this work session?
I'm actually going to let Deidre Emerson, our Deputy City Manager, introduce this.
Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor and Council. The highly anticipated, most affectionately known as Silver Bullet presentation has arrived, and we are excited to share it with you this afternoon. We really want to make sure that we extend our deepest gratitude and thanks to Cooper Foundation for funding this housing study for us. Today we have Marjorie Willow, and she will introduce the rest of her team. With Mullen, Lonergan, and Associates will present the strategic housing plan. During this time, they will report findings regarding the housing disparities and related factors associated with the lack of affordable housing and provide strategies and recommendations to address Waco's affordable housing issues. Following their presentation, Galen Price will present a proposed implementation plan and next steps to execute the recommendations. Before we turn it over to Marjorie, I do want to extend a huge thank you to Renisha Hutnell, who has served as our interim housing director and facilitated the process of pulling the housing study together. So thank you, Renisha. I will now turn it over to Marjorie.
Thank you. I'd also like to introduce my team who is joining me remotely from Pittsburgh. And that is Bill Wazaleski, and also a principal with the firm, Jessica Lurs, who is a senior project manager, and also Kevin Tang, who is a community development specialist with us. So for today's presentation, we're going to give you a very brief purpose of why this was conducted. We'll look at trends, also that drive housing affordability in Waco, and describe how well Waco's housing market meets demand. And we've also identified 6 market types for the purpose of targeting some of the recommendations that we'll also review with you. So when we started out with this plan, we were looking specifically to meet these 7 objectives: addressing displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods, of which Waco has a few, focusing on equity and inclusion in terms of developing the recommendations, focusing on the preservation of the existing affordable housing stock, of which Waco has a significant stock, identifying resources that could be used to expand affordable housing, addressing infill development needs, looking at state legislation specifically to assist in implementation, and utilizing and incorporating best practices that have been effective elsewhere, specifically in Texas, as part of our recommendations. So about the data that we used in this study, we began our research a year ago. And at that time, the data that was available to us, the most current versions, included the 2015 to 2019 American Community Survey data and the 2013 to 2017 CHAZ data set. And the CHAZ data set is a HUD formulated data set created by the Census specifically for HUD communities such as Waco that have to complete consolidated plans. By July of last year, the 2020 redistricting data was made available publicly, but this data was very limited in scope. It provided total population by race, ethnicity, the voting age of 18 and older, and total housing units by occupancy status, so whether a housing unit was vacant or occupied. Where appropriate throughout the study, we did update the data using the redistricting data, particularly where there was a significant difference between the data we had already used and that redistricting data. Last September, HUD finally released the 2014 to 2018 CHAZ data set, but by then we had already completed our data analysis. In March of this year, the Census has announced that they will, it's a tentative release date for 2020 Census data for places. Waco is considered a place, and minor civil divisions, but it will only be at the Census, at the citywide level, not at the Census tract level. But just last week, the Census did state that they hope to still stay on track to release the 2016 to 2020 American Community Survey data in mid to late March of this year. So again, wherever possible in the study, at the time we conducted the data, we were using the most current data at the time. So now a few key trends that we want to highlight that we identified as driving housing affordability in Waco. So household growth between 2010 and 2019 expanded 10.3%, meaning an additional 4,400 households were added in the city. This was eclipsed by population growth, which was about 11.2%. But when we talk about housing need, we find that it's a more useful threshold, useful variable if you talk about household growth as opposed to just population growth. Every household needs a housing unit. So for example, if 100 new households move to Waco, they all need a new housing unit. But if 100 households within Waco add an additional family member, either through birth, adoption, an elderly family moving in, those 100 households don't necessarily need a new housing unit, although the population would have increased. What we also identified was some of the most common jobs in Waco are lower paying and have been vulnerable to economic stability due to the pandemic over the last 18 months. So although the hospitality sector may have expanded prior to that in Waco, as it has across the country, these are the jobs typically that require frequent interaction with customers that have really been hit the hardest by the pandemic. We also identified that 1/3 of all Waco households had incomes below $25,000 in 2019. Of those, nearly 13% had incomes below $10,000. And when you're talking about affordable housing, paying no more than 30% of your income on your housing cost, if you have less than $10,000 a year in income, that becomes extremely unlikely, if possible at all. So in this slide, focus on the darkest green, which indicate those households who are paying more than 50% of their income on housing expenses. So in the bar to the far left, the entire bar represents households who earn 0 to 30% of the median income. So in Waco in 2019, median income was about $40,000. And so 30% would be about $12,000. So of those households who were in that income range, over 5,200 of them were paying more than half of their income on rent, on gross rent, and that includes rent plus utilities. An additional 675 were paying more than 30% of their income. Even looking in the 31 to 50% income category, you're still looking at a significant number of households who are paying more than 50% and more than 30% of their income on housing.
Mayor, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just, I don't mean to interrupt the flow here, but I just want to make sure I understand, how are we defining households? Is that a single family, multifamily, duplex,
It's
or
all
just anything?
households. No, okay, so you're speaking in terms of housing units. These are strictly households. So these are the people who make up the households. And these are all renter households.
Okay, I still don't understand. So 48,903 is,
Oh, I'm sorry, you're referring to the median income of about 40,000 that I
no,
mentioned?
I'm back on, let me see, slide 6, I guess it is. Back a couple slides. That's one, and maybe say that again. So households, yeah, back. Another one. Just the first, yeah, that one.
Okay,
Tell me what is 48,903? That's,
just the number of households.
and households again is,
That's all households, which can consist of one or more people who live together as a single housekeeping unit. So
So-
single
so that
individuals as well as families.
incorporated
and
within
others.
that are homes, single-family homes, apartment complexes. Am I right, Deidre?
But she's talking about, there's two different things I think she's saying, Jim. One is households is defined as like the group of people who live together. So if a single guy lives in an apartment, that's a household. If
Right.
a wife and a husband and kids live in a household together, that's a household. If three college roommates live together, that's a household, right?
That's just the population.
complicating.
Driven by the
And then there's
population,
also
not-
housing units, which would be like multifamily housing, but like, it doesn't matter, like, you could have a household in a single-family home, you could have a household in a apartment complex, that's like more of a grouping of people that you measure, right?
The house, all, whether it's single-family units, single apartments within a multifamily structure, they're all households, and they're measured, in this instance, they're all measured for the purpose of how many households in total resided in Waco in 2019. Does that help?
Yeah, and, is there a breakdown of that at some point?
In the document
presentation?
there is, yes.
Excuse me?
In the document there is. In this presentation, we're only highlighting key trends.
Okay.
Councilmember Holmes, what she's referencing is in the final housing study document, the breakdown will be a part of that document.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so then when we look at housing inventory, now we're turning to the issue of the housing units in which the households live. So between 2010 and 2019, over 4,000 new units were added to Waco's housing inventory. But among all of those, multifamily structures with 5 or more units. So think of it in terms of apartment structures that had at least 5 units or more. That segment of the housing market represented only 540 new units over that nine-year period. What's significant about that is that affordable multifamily structures can be a more affordable housing option than individual single-family units, detached units. So the fact that household growth occurred at that 10.3% rate, but only 540 new units were added to the inventory is an available segment to only address a small portion of the household need. Excuse me, the housing need. So this is a very interesting slide, which lays the groundwork for a couple of recommendations. So I'd like to try to break this down for you. So Waco had a high vacancy rate of 11.3% in 2019, which means all of the units that were identified as vacant for a variety of reasons, equaled 11.3% of the total segment, about 6,300 units. Nearly half of these, according to the American Community Survey, were off-market and unavailable for occupancy. So when you look at this chart, if you start at the bottom and you look at the lightest green section on both bars, these are identified as units for rent. The trend you see here in 2010 and 2019 is that there were less than half of the units vacant for rent in 2019 than there were in 2010. If you move up and go to that teal colored, you'll see that in 2010, 647 units were available for sale, vacant and available for sale. Slightly less, 617 in 2019. Excuse me, 399 in 2019. When you go up to the darker color, the darker teal, in 2010 you had 231 units that were identified as vacant for seasonal or recreational use. And so these would be units that would be available, for example, these would be vacation homes, what some communities call football homes on football weekends, but also your short-term rentals in Waco. And what's interesting in this case is that that number almost tripled from 231 units in 2010 to 617 units in 2019. So that means that these units, they're not available for your year-round population. They're being used for other purposes, seasonal and recreational use primarily. Then when you move up on both bars again to the darkest green, this is the largest segment of your vacant housing inventory. In 2010, it was a little over 2,300 units, but by 2019, it was almost 3,000 units. So these other vacant units represent units in which no one is living in them, and they're taken off the market. So people are using them either maybe for storage, they could be tied up in estate issues, heirship title. They could be simply not habitable. They could be in not inhabitable condition, and the owners are not interested in rehabbing them. But for whatever reason, they're simply not on the market and available for rent as housing. And then the top purple color on both sides of the chart, those are simply units that are vacant, but they were, at the time of the survey, they were rented or sold, but just simply not occupied. So those were also not available on the market. They had already been sort of spoken for. But it's that darker green segment of the bar that is really significant.
That confuses me because I feel like given the market right now, where it's a pretty hot housing market, people are fixing up houses, so the uninhabitable part doesn't make sense from a financial perspective. I don't know. I know that I'm sure there are people that use houses for storage, but I can't imagine that constituting a really large segment. I guess my question is, what analysis do you have that you think is causing this? What's the purpose of that? Because that doesn't add up to me.
So the only analysis, and those were examples that I gave, the only analysis that we have is simply the census response. So when you receive your, and in this case it would be American Community Survey, so about 300,000 people each month receive a survey for the estimate that occurs between the 10-year decennial census. And they fill out that questionnaire. And do you own a home is a question. You answer those questions. Do you own any other homes? So they would say yes. Then who occupies that home? Is it occupied? And it's from there that that number is taken. There are a lot of reasons why, when we have no way to identify why those 2,946 units are vacant, but not being used as residential units. It's simply the number that's provided by the ACS data.
Okay.
Mayor, I wonder if, thinking about houses for sale in North Waco, like if you have a house that's in really bad shape, maybe in 2019 you could get $35,000 for that. But even with this data being, not based in 2021 you might be able to get $150,000. So maybe there wasn't the impetus to sell or move one of those properties in 2019 that there is now, because the market is so hot and because our housing stock is so
I just
limited.
think financially not renting a unit, like when I see this dark green comment, just like you own it and you're not making it available for rent or sale. And there are instances where people will do that, but in my experience, that's really limited because people want to make money on their asset, either through renting it for whatever they can get or selling it. And again, people own 2 houses that they use for storage, but I just think this data set seems odd to me, that having been in real estate in Waco in 2019, and I think that's a great discussion point, Kelly. I'm not discounting it. It's odd to me because this is a huge segment that we're obviously going to probably rely a bunch of information on. And it's just is baffling to me because, again, most people who have an asset like real estate want to be generating income from that real estate either through renting it or selling it, and not just letting it sit idle.
And Mayor, to Councilmember Palmer's point, there are other things that one may have to consider in that. I mean, if you're dealing with airships,
Yes.
and that can go into personal knowledge, that can go into litigation for years.
Yeah.
So it's not something that could be rectified overnight.
That's a good
So-
point. And it still is, it just is a staggering number that there's that many units sitting unoccupied by anybody.
Oh, yeah.
Again, with the knowledge of, again, yes, that happens. And yes, sometimes that forces those units to be unoccupied, but even oftentimes when there's airship issues, someone's there. So to take, it's a confusing data set to me that I'll just acknowledge it. We can keep moving.
I've got 2 quick follow-ups, and apologies for belaboring, but on the dark green, let's say we've got a house that could be condemned would be one that would be subject to condemnation proceedings. No one is there.
Yes.
So that would be one type of home. Another question on this data set with 2019, does this go through December 31, 2019? I'm trying to think of kind of where the cutoff point of these numbers are.
It would, because, again, about 300,000 a month, so I think it's about 3.5 million households are surveyed each year. Normally, the data set comes out in September, October of the following year, so it would have been for that entire year.
Okay, so this would
calendar
be
year.
a snapshot that ends at the closing of 2019,
Yes.
not taking into the last 2 years into effect. And then on the, right under the dark green, the kind of the medium green there, going from 231 to 617, would that also incorporate short-term rental properties like Airbnbs, things used for non-full-time residential use?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
So any kind of unit, it's not on the market for sale or for rent, but the best way to describe it is used infrequently by people who have a usual residence elsewhere.
Okay. Thank you.
One thing I do want to point out is that the redistricting data for 2020, which came out last year, did report that the total vacancy rate in Waco went down to 10.1%. I don't have a breakdown like that, but maybe in a few months we would.
You said it's you said on the left side of the screen, it's a high vacancy rate. What does that mean and how does that compare to other cities? The 11.3, I guess, was high, you say here.
The 11.3%? It is high. I'm not sure we've worked in a city where we had a rate that high. Usually, I would say it's more, and I'm just going off memory where we've worked before, but it's more in the maybe like 6 to 9% or so. And I think what's really interesting in this case, in Waco, is that number that categorized by the Census Bureau as other vacant and are not on the market. like the others are for sale or for rent, or, you know, even off the market but available for seasonal use. That seems to be a really high number.
Yeah, that's weird. So when you say it's a high vacancy rate compared to other cities, that means there's more, even despite that other vacant, you would say there's a high number of available units compared to other, a higher number of available units compared to other cities. Is that what that's saying?
Yeah, I want to say that the, you know, there's a lot of research just on vacant units across the country. I think 12% is considered very high, and when you hit 20%, it's referred to as a hyper vacancy rate. I think what's good in this case, though, is that from the between 2019 and when the redistricting data came out, it went down more than a percentage point. So now it's only down to 10.1%. You know, how many of those have been taken off the market for STRs or have been acquired and rehabilitated and are now rented or listed for rent? We won't know for a few more months.
Okay.
That would be a really interesting statistic, though, to go back and revisit.
What's the impact of having, and if this is coming up, let me know, but is that good for renters to have an occupancy rate of 11.3% or 10%? Is that?
But not all of those units that are vacant are available for renters.
Okay, so how does the availability for, I guess, the categories for sale or for rent, how does that compare to other markets?
So in generally speaking, when you have a vacancy rate among for sale units or owner occupied units of 2 to 3%, that's considered a healthy rate. For renters, it's higher, about 5 to 7% is considered a good vacancy rate. And if you think about it, there's more churning in the rental market than there is in the homeowner market. And so having a vacancy rate of at least 5% in the rental market means that there's availability for new people coming in, people who want to move up need to move down in terms of cost. That's sort of what we look for. And
so of the 11.3%, how much of that is availability in the rental market? What percentage of that is? Does that question make sense?
Right, so it's that 399 on that second chart for 2019 that are vacant for rent.
Is it the lightest green is the one for rent, correct?
I'm sorry, the 1296 for
Yep.
rent, yes. The for sale is 399,
Okay.
correct. So about 1,300 units for 2019, vacant for rent.
Out of the 55, 180, right? Macro.
So is that good for this community? What is that? What's the analysis of that?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what that percentage is.
Okay, we can come back to that.
Yeah.
I just think that's something
I think when we show you what we call the housing mismatch is, that might come into clearer focus.
Great.
Okay, yeah, let's go back to the macro. We're talking about 55,180 is our housing inventory. 48,000 is our households. 48,903 is the household need or capacity or.
Correct.
So there's excess, but it's on this chart. It's complicated because it falls all in here somewhere. So we're not short on housing, we're long on housing, but it's sort of, this chart shows the problems of where that excess housing is.
If you're looking strictly at housing units and households, that might be more correct, but when you look at what is actually available for rent and is being rented, and owner units or for sale units that are actually being occupied, that's not the case.
Okay.
And again, when we talk about the mismatch, meaning the income level of the households living in the cost of the housing unit, you'll see where there's a larger gap than even this slide would speak to.
Okay.
Okay, so in this slide, it's not necessarily a factor that affects affordability, but it is more of a result of a lack of affordable housing in the market for a specific segment of households. So when we looked at the number of households that used housing choice vouchers, so this is also more familiarly known as the Section 8 program administered by the Housing Authority. Black households represent 78% of those currently holding a housing choice voucher, but they only represent 23% of all households in Waco. I will tell you that this is a common trend that we see in many other communities where black households are far overrepresented among housing choice voucher households. They also account for more than 2/3 of the public housing and the housing choice voucher waiting list applicants. So what this tells us is that for your lowest income households, 0 to 30%, as well as up to 50% with housing choice vouchers, there's simply not enough units on the out in the private market where black households could use their housing choice voucher and go and obtain a unit that they can afford. And finally, we also analyzed some tax records for your STR program. So when we made a previous presentation, this was really a topic of interest, and we were asked to do a bit more research. And that, I think the comments at the time when we made this were, there was a great concern that these STR units were being taken off, that they were actually affordable housing units that were being taken out of the market and not available for local renters or even local homeowners. And so when we looked at the acquisition prices, so the sales prices of these units that were acquired by owners who then converted them to short-term rental units, what we found was that those units were priced primarily in the 0 to 30% income range, which meant they would have been affordable to households at that very low income range, as well as the higher income range, the highest in this case of greater than 121%. And so this really got us thinking that there's a shortage of affordable housing, and this was a segment of housing units that were being literally, again, removed from the market and made for accommodating tourists and visitors, when really there wasn't an adequate level of affordable housing stock for residents year-round in Waco.
Do you have the raw numbers on these? Or
We do. You can sort of look at it on this one. So the 0 to 30% represents about 75 units total. Okay. The 121% is about 55 units. So it's certainly not a large segment, but a lot of the units came from within the same neighborhood where
right.
most of the STR units were acquired.
Correct.
And our assumption is because they were, the cost was lower to acquire them, especially if they needed renovation, than to make them attractive as short-term rental properties for visitors.
I would imagine too, just anecdotally, we know these are in our low-income BIPOC communities, which just makes this feel awful.
It's core community. So, anytime you're looking at where your downtown is and where your ring neighborhoods and your core neighborhoods, historically they are and have been occupied by people of color, especially post-white flight and suburbia and the way growth goes. So, as time has lapsed and people flee, what was left empty or dormant or was in the core parts, and so it's prime to be plucked as it has been. So yes, the number 75 may be small. However, if you put 20 of them in one neighborhood, that's huge, because that that has then eliminated a whole group of
Right.
people, a whole neighborhood, if you will, of available housing for particular units. So I mean, just if you consider, District 1, 2, and 4, you've got whole neighborhoods that are eliminated in just 75 houses.
It basically comes down to where an investor's return on his or her investment would be the greatest,
Sure.
so.
But to Councilwoman Beerfield's point, we know that probably likely a lot of these houses are occupied by multi-generational families too. So this is where in Woodway, a single house might have 4 people. This might be a home that is home to 8 residents, 9 residents, and so that pushing of people feels a little bit more intense and predatory than it might elsewhere.
Ma'am, did you say that you were somewhat surprised by the breakdown? Is it the spike at kind of both the lower end and the higher end being somewhat of a surprise?
Right. Right, especially that 0 to 30%. And I would say, even adding in the additional 30 units, so now we're over 100 units of of housing units that were, the sales price would have been affordable to a 0 to 50% household. That's a significant number. 100 housing units in just a couple of neighborhoods would have an extreme impact.
Again, just to follow up the context, this is roughly 200-ish homes altogether we're talking about in the inventory of almost 50,000, right?
On the surface, correct.
Okay.
But I think when you look more specifically at, narrow it down to the neighborhoods in which those housing units are.
Data.
We do, it's in the
Okay.
document. We've outlined, I believe, an STR study area because it was where the majority of those housing units were located.
Because Clint, we know where the STRs are, and you're right, there's some concentrations. It'll be interesting. I just think as we solve this problem, I think there's gonna be a different point of attack than STRs, just intuitively. But let's keep going.
So now we want to highlight some trends that shows how well Waco's housing market meets demand for affordable housing. So on a positive note, when we look at rental units, a majority of your rental units, 54%, are what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, also referred to as NOAHs. And this means that these are units that were developed probably 20 years ago or more with no public subsidy. And so they're going to be your older housing stock. But a majority of those units are affordable to households between 50 to 81% of income. When we look at, for owner units, it's an even larger segment that are affordable to households up to 80%. But when you expand that to up to 100% of median income, which was $40,000, more than 8 out of 10 existing owner units are affordable to them. So when we take that and distill it down to who are the most at-risk households who are currently housed in Waco, it breaks down to this. Your extremely low income owners and renters who are at 0 to 30% and who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, plus those in the same category that are paying more than 50% of their income for housing. So this is your lowest income group, paying renters and owners paying more than 30 or 50% for their housing, which is a little over 7,100 households. And this number of households represent those that are the most precariously housed in Waco. And what we mean by that is, something as simple as, for most of us, I shouldn't say simple, but something as an event such as, losing several shifts, having your number of shifts cut for several consecutive paychecks, a car that breaks down and you can't afford to fix it, therefore you can't get to your job. Anything like that for more of us would mean, okay, we can use, for example, some emergency savings. These households would not have that option available to them. And so it wouldn't take very much for someone who is a renter, some of those 675 extremely low-income renters who are paying more than half of their income on housing, for them to become homeless.
We also reviewed the homeless services system as part of this study. And similar to what we saw in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, we saw a disproportionate number of Black households experiencing homelessness within the continuum of care. While Black residents represent 22% of Waco's population, they accounted for 38% of people experiencing homelessness during the 2020 point in time count. This mirrors national homeless data information, where nationally Black households accounted for 40% of all people experiencing homelessness in 2019, despite representing only 13% of the US population. Further analysis of the homeless services inventory showed that the majority of the permanent supportive housing units within the continuum of care are exclusively for veterans. Permanent supportive housing has been shown to increase health outcomes, provide long-term housing stability, and increase overall quality of life for residents because they receive such high levels of support. According to the 2020 housing inventory count, the continuum of care had a total of 138 permanent supportive housing units. Of those, 81 were dedicated to people who are chronically homeless or experiencing homelessness for 1 full year. And of those 81 beds, 74 of those were exclusively for veteran households.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about residency patterns and what I referred to earlier as a housing mismatch. So to present this information, I've given you 3 of the income levels for renters on this chart to walk you through it, and then I'll show you what the next slide will be, the entire universe of renters. So in this case, the greatest housing mismatch occurs among renters in the lowest income tier, 0 to 30%, where there are almost 2,200 units affordable, only 2,200 units affordable to almost 8,000 households. So when you look at the 2 blue bars on your far left, for each of these set of bars, the bar on the left is the number of households, and the bar on the right is the number of units that are affordable at the same income range as the household. So in the case of the 0 to 30% group, those 7,897 households have incomes at 0 to 30% of the Waco median of $40,000. But in 2019, there were only just under 2,200 units that rented for a rent affordable to that 0 to 30. So it's 0 to 30 income for the households, but basically a 0 to 30% renter price for the units. So then that leaves a 5,700 unit gap. 5,700 units are needed to house those 7,800 households. What I will tell you, and it's explained in greater detail in the document, is that those 2,199 units are not all occupied by 0 to 30%. At least 500 units are occupied by higher income households. So keep that in mind as we move right on this slide. So I left out the 30 to 50 and the 50 to 80 and 80 100 because their differences, their mismatch is not as stark as these two higher income groups. So in the middle, in the green, 1,135 households at 101 to 120% of median income. Only 757 units at that same price range. And then the gap is even greater among the 121% and higher. So your highest income among renters, your highest income group, 2,600 households, there are only 378 units. So what this means is that because there are not enough units available at the prices in the income, for the income range of the households that are residing in Waco, then people are living outside of their income range. For the highest income households, it then becomes an issue of renting down market. So if I'm number 379 of those households and I don't have a unit available to me because there's only 378, I have to look elsewhere. And that's just a very simplistic way of explaining it. Those 2,223 households that are not served in the 120% and higher have to look elsewhere. If you think about it, when we talk about housing affordability, the 30% being the threshold for paying, living in affordable housing or being cost burdened is the ceiling, but there's no floor. So if you want to buy a house, or in this case, rent a housing unit, maybe you can afford $1,000 a month in rent, but if you find the apartment that you like for only $700 a month in rent, you can go well below that 30% threshold. The challenge, though, is that those 0 to 30%, the lowest, the extremely low income rental segment of households in Waco, don't have that ability to pay more and rent upmarket. So what we did find, however, and I'm going to show you in this slide, is that many of them are renting higher. So they're paying more, 50% or more. They're living doubled up, maybe even 3 households in a housing unit, depending on the size. But what this slide shows is the universe of households on the right side by income group. And if you follow the arrow, the color matches on the same side, on the right side. So at the bottom, the red households, 7,897 renter households, they can afford the 2,199 units that are priced for their income level. Moving up to the orange, you will see that there are 3,972 households, but they have available to them not only the 6,313 housing units that are affordable to their income range, but also the 2,199 units that are really in the 0 to 30% income. So as you move up on that right side bar, each step higher in terms of households, they can all afford the level of rent in the income range below them. But when you're at the red level, the 0 to 30%, there is no lower limit to go to. What's really interesting on this slide is if you look at the 2 highest income groups. So purple, 1,135 renter households. In the dark gray, 2,601 households. Neither of them have enough housing units to rent at their same income level. And this is one of the reasons that they are renting down market. There's simply not, it's the primary reason, there's simply not enough units in their income level out there for them to rent.
Real quick clarification on the overall data. For the most part, unless otherwise stated, these are City of Waco jurisdiction units. Is that fair to say?
These are in the city. Yes.
So would this include rental units available in Belmead, Lacey Lakeview, or Hewitt?
Is that outside?
Those are outside the jurisdiction of our city, but they're adjacent to our city.
I'd have to clarify that for you. I don't want to state something that's wrong.
So we have a lot of jurisdictions. In fact, we have a city that's entirely enveloped by our city, which is the city of Beverly Hills, which is surrounded on all sides by Waco. And we have a number of small bedroom communities like that, Woodway, Hewitt, Lacey Lakeview, Belmead, that are, you wouldn't necessarily know unless you saw it posted that you were in a different jurisdiction, but they would, I would assume that most renters aren't looking at city lines so much as school district lines as when they're, you know, in the market for something new.
So this data is taken from what's called the Public Use microsample data, which is a set of census data, and it's derived from the actual census questions. And so there are 2 geographic areas for public use microsample data that cover Waco. One covers what we call inner Waco, so it's the city of Waco, which probably includes Beverly Hills, because the second one, the second Puma area, covers the rest of McLennan County.
Real quick, before, in these residency patterns, as we're looking, how is it comparable to other cities in this manner? So for instance, those who are at 100 to 120 AMI or 121 plus, is that the same in other cities that are, you know, that they have those few units available to them? Or is that just localized here?
I can speak to the bottom of the bar, so the lowest income category, more knowledgeably, but this is a situation that we run into quite frequently. There's simply not enough units at the lowest income.
Well, that part I understand, but
Yeah, I couldn't answer you,
I
just
guess
guessing.
I'm curious because I need to know, are we always going to have the issue of down market issues with people who can afford?
Yes.
Because if other cities have comparable amounts of, if I can afford the house or to afford the rent the condo or whatever, it's available to me. But in Waco, we can't, it's just not there.
It's helpful to gauge how we're doing here.
Exactly.
Okay, so a few things that impact that. So even though someone has, is in the 121% income category, which is, well over $50,000, and everything higher, that can be a 2-income earner household. They could have 3 kids, and they could both have college debt. So that is going to push them down market, regardless of what their income.
Sure.
If you think about, the issues, the challenges in getting lumber over the last several months as it relates to the pandemic, although that issue has been resolved more, but then there's still other issues in terms of supply chain and labor, and just not being able to build housing fast enough for those upper income categories. That would also be affecting it. But I would just be taking a guess if I said yes.
Maybe we can come back, we can circle back and try to compare to other
That's
jurisdictions.
fine, and I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm just curious, as this data was set for 19, and so that was pre-pandemic, and I'm just curious as to how we compare with others. That's something we can dig through and look at later.
Okay, so when you look at owners, a different pattern emerges, especially for the 0 to 30%. So there you have actually quite an abundance of units that are affordable, homeowner units, owner-occupied units, for sale units, sales units that are appropriately priced for 0 to 30%. So you have 1,864 households and over 5,000 units. But that gap in your two highest income categories also remains among owners. 1,100 units and 4,200 units in your two highest incomes. And this is what it looks like when you look at the universe of owner units and the housing mismatch. So in this case, the units at the highest income level are, the households at the higher income levels are really forced to look down market because of their lack of supply in their income range. So one of the things we also did was we looked at trying to type the markets. So identifying market types by similar characteristics. And we identified 6 market types in Waco. And we find this useful so that when you are looking at strategies to implement, basing where those what type of strategies and where they will be implemented, it's useful to look at market types. So for example, earlier in the presentation we talked about those NOAHs, those naturally occurring affordable housing units. So these are your older housing units. It's good, stable stock. More than likely, quite a bit of it probably needs some maintenance, as well as some maybe general rehabilitation. And so these typing the neighborhoods then by market type then helps you to direct where the resources, where the strategies would be most appropriate for implementing. So in market type A, and this is the same for all 6 markets on the map on the left side of your screen. First of all, there's 3 grayed out census tracts in each of the market types. So census tract 3, and sort of in the center there is Baylor University, the campus proper. Census tract 11 in the northeast corner is an area that has an overwhelming number of renter units and therefore did not provide us with enough data in order to be able to incorporate it into an existing market type. And then census tract 9800 is the airport. So in these 3 cases, there simply was not enough data available for all of the variables that we looked at to identify these 6 market types. So you'll see them grayed out in all the markets. In this case, for market type A, those census tracts that you see as green on the slide, those are identified here as market type A, and then the remaining market types are different colors. And we created the market types by census tract because of the way that it's just easier to use census tract level data. But in some cases, you do have neighborhoods that straddle 2 different census tracts that are part of 2 different markets. So if you hear me mention a neighborhood a couple of times, that's basically what it means. So looking at market type A, overall we qualify this as a relatively weak market. It has exhibited population decrease, however, with an increase in Hispanic residents. There's high unemployment with corresponding low income. But it does trend younger with a below average age of 28, a very low percentage of bachelor degrees, and high cost burden among both renters and owners. The oldest housing stock in the city is located in these census tracts with the lowest housing values, which indicate a lower quality stock in need of rehabilitation. There is increasing ownership, home ownership in here, which is could be due to the Hispanic households moving into those neighborhoods. and it also has the lowest gross rent, which includes rent plus utilities in these areas. So market type B is illustrated with the three sort of yellowish census tracts. These are adjacent to or very close to the Baylor campus. And the market type here is very heavily influenced by its location to Baylor University. So you have these opposite ends of the spectrum characteristics: lowest income, high unemployment with the highest levels of college degrees. So it's reflective of the high population of college students who live here, as well as other homeowners, whether it's faculty, staff, and other residents who live in these three census tracts. The youngest population, again, reflective of the college student population. The largest decrease in homeowners, and also with an increase in, decrease in homeowners among an increase in STRs. Highest rates of cost burden for both renters and owners in this market type. It also has some of your newer housing stock. I believe that's primarily in Census Tract 19. The largest increase in housing value with a modest gross rent increase. High access to job centers, primarily the university, but also downtown, and lower access to transit and supermarkets in terms of just other quality of life indicators. Market type C is reflected in the purple census tracts. So here is one of the market types where we see an increase in population driven primarily by Black residents. There's a moderate level of college education with a corresponding below average unemployment. The highest increase in home ownership, along with a moderate increase in renters. Some cost burden for renters and owners. And your highest number of STRs are found in this market type, along with below average housing values, and the only area to have a decrease in vacant units, which could be attributed to the STR presence. This is an older housing stock in some regards, so rehab would be appropriate for some of the units. There's also been the highest increase in rent in these neighborhoods, in this market type. But it also has the highest access to job centers and transit. Market type D. The neighborhoods in market type D, illustrated in red, really form an arc around the core of downtown, maybe even including some neighborhoods that are the core of the city. There's also a significant amount of commercial uses in these neighborhoods with slight population growth, increases in both Black and Hispanic residents. A low rate of college degrees, below average incomes, but also below average unemployment as well. A moderate increase in renters with moderate rates of cost burden. This is an older housing stock in this market type, below average values. There's a high number of housing flips, but they don't appear to be related to STRs. And this would also be a housing stock in need of rehabilitation. This market type and the neighborhoods in it also have high access to transit and the highest access to job centers. Market type E is illustrated with the darker blue. This is a very strong market overall. Largest population growth driven by increases in Black and Hispanic residents, again. Moderate rate of college degrees, the highest income level with the older average age of 39 and below average employment. So this is going to be more of your the age group where people are more settled into their stronger income earning years in this market type. It's very stable, a large decrease in renters, minimal change in ownership, which is also a sign of stability, highest income with the lowest rates of cost burden, which would be expected. Highest housing values in the city are in this market type, and the second highest gross rent. Highest increase in vacancy rates we believe are more attributable to new construction that's occurring. And the final market type is illustrated in this sort of gold brown. Again, another strong market type. Market type E and market type F are where, if you look at where most of the new housing construction occurred, it's in those peripheral neighborhoods outside of the core area. Again, a large population increase in these neighborhoods driven by Black and Hispanic residents. The second highest income, but also the oldest average age, 41, which I don't think is very old, but in terms of median age for census, I guess it is. It's also, again, just another market type where it's the households who live there are into their more, they're higher or beginning to enter their higher income earning potential at that age. High levels of college degrees, the newest housing stock. Again, high rates of flipping, but probably more due to the construction. So the developer, the builder owns the home and then is flipping the new homes once the buyers come in. And low access to transit due to their location outside of the core central area where transit is, and less access to job centers. But these households will depend on their own vehicles to get to their jobs. Okay, so that describes to you the housing market as well as the housing market types. And what we want to do now is just basically sort of set you up for the recommendations and the framework under which we devise the recommendations. So the first thing is supply. So household growth is not being adequately served by the housing supply at both the lower end and the upper end of the income spectrum. And as a result of an inadequate supply, higher income households are buying and renting down market, living in units that are affordable to households in lower income tiers. This trend has the most detrimental effect on the most economically insecure income tier, the extremely low income households at 0 to 30% of median income. And an inadequate housing supply has also driven up housing cost. And so several of the recommendations then are made for the intent of expanding the overall supply, not just affordable housing units for your lowest income, but just overall supply of housing in the city with a focus on affordable housing and mixed income developments where you have both market rate as well as affordable units, perhaps subsidized. The second part of that framework is stability. So compounding the housing shortage is a local economy in which some of the most common jobs are low-paying and vulnerable during times of economic downturn. Almost half of all jobs in 2019 paid wages that required working more than 40 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom unit. So our recommendations then are based on the premised upon reinvesting and stabilizing housing and households in neighborhoods that have long been neglected. But now they're experiencing growth and revitalization. And so stability in these neighborhoods that are realizing new investment, whether public investment or private investment that is showing interest in these neighborhoods will be very important, so that the long-term homeowners and renters and even small business owners are able to remain in those neighborhoods and reap the benefits of the revitalization going on in their neighborhoods.
When you say stability, could you define that?
So in terms of overall neighborhood stability, you know, what is a common theme that's happened for, you know, a few decades and continues to happen today is when investors move in to an area and are looking to acquire properties, sort of as we touched on earlier, where their return on their investment is going to be the greatest. Those neighborhoods tend to be, those properties tend to be located in neighborhoods that are either in the core downtown or surrounding the neighborhoods that immediately surround the downtown. And so this is basically gentrification that is occurring. But the negative impact of gentrification is when that reinvestment happens without regard to the people who already live there. So when landlords realize that they can be charging more rent, that puts those long-term renters who are there now at risk for eviction and having to relocate. Same thing with homeowners. So the prices of homes might increase, but there's also the option, there's also the chance that the homeowners who have lived there for a long time see their taxes increase as a result of the properties around them becoming more valuable. And so when we talk about stabilizing housing and households in the neighborhoods, it's basically putting into place anti-displacement measures that protect their ability to stay there if they want to stay.
Okay.
And there's several different various methods that other cities use regarding the recommendations. And I assume that later in the presentation there may be direct recommendations for the city of Waco, because I know, I mean, you can go from anywhere to legacy rate, tax rates to community. I mean, there's so many of the conversations that have been happening within this community, but I'm just hopeful that that's in the vein of where we're going with this, because yes, it's clear that there's some form of stability has to happen, and that, you know, where we are now, it is not that way, nor a pathway looking forward. But so I assume that's coming later?
Yes.
Awesome.
And then finally, the third piece of the framework is subsidy. So in housing supply, meaning making facilitating an adequate supply of housing, as well as stabilizing the neighborhoods and households where appropriate. When those both are inadequate, then subsidies are needed for households who are at risk of becoming homeless. And that's a significant segment of the households that are what we refer to as precariously housed, well over 7,000 of those. And so that's when the subsidy would be more appropriate and needed, in addition to increasing housing supply and stabilizing households and neighborhoods. So, the recommendations. So, just a word about the recommendations. We have them categorized by supply, stability, and subsidy. But there's also a group of recommendations that didn't fit neatly into one of those categories, and so we just refer to them as administrative strategies. So this might be considered some of the strategies that may, in some cases, need to be implemented first in order to build upon them, in order to sort of stabilize a foundation upon which the other recommendations can be implemented. And that's the case in this first strategy in terms of building a more robust community services department. So you have a community services department that does quite a bit of work already, but some of these recommendations that are included are they're aggressive, They've been tried elsewhere, so we know that there's success in those, but they also require a lot of staff time to not only just create a new program, but also to build up the capacity. So whether it's, adding more staff or more funding, but in terms of being able to accomplish and implement and achieve success through these recommendations, it really will require a significant team of experienced personnel to implement and coordinate the strategies on a citywide basis. Our second administrative strategy is to prioritize city resources to finance affordable housing initiatives. So, it's obvious that affordable housing is an issue, is a priority for this council, if for another reason because you commissioned this study. And so now the next step is to reassess how your resources that are available now for affordable housing, but also additional resources that could be made available for affordable housing initiatives, how they could be repositioned so that there are available dollars to finance some of these initiatives. So Waco is a HUD entitlement community. It receives community development block grant funds and home funds every year. And I don't even know what the budget is, but as with every other community we work in, I can tell you that those two programs alone are insufficient to address only that which they should be funding. So then to ask even more of those programs is not going to, you're not going to get anywhere really. And I'm sure you all know this. But evaluating how general funds, your American Rescue Plan funds, and other resources that can be prioritized to address specific housing needs, that should be we recommend that be a priority with this council, with the goal of expanding the overall inventory. Now, we realize that it's not likely that the city would help to finance housing for the upper income levels, but there are some policy changes, some policy recommendations that we're making that could help facilitate that. We're also recommending, and we'll get into a bit more detail in later, a few slides down, but capitalizing a housing trust fund. So in all of the communities that we work, we make this recommendation. But a housing trust fund is probably the most significant recommendation that you could implement. A housing trust fund is established by a local ordinance, and basically it's the city's responsibility to capitalize it, to put funds in it. But what makes it such a useful tool is that it's free from the state and federal regulations that all the other programs that come into the city are restrict, how you can use them. And it is governed by a local board, so local people are making decisions how to spend the money, who's to benefit from it. And the limits of the housing trust fund are basically the ones you, as council, encapsulate in the enabling ordinance that creates the housing trust fund. So this is something that we see in many communities, and we provide some best practice communities in the document so that you're able to go and see what the millions and millions of dollars that they've invested in new housing as a result of having a housing trust fund. It can also accept contributions from philanthropic organizations as well. Look at proceeds from the sale of city-owned assets, and these proceeds could also be put into your housing trust fund as well. And that we're impressed with the extent to which the city's tax increment residential zones have been designated specifically for supporting site development cost and initiatives that could result in new affordable housing throughout the city. And we'll speak to that a bit more later as well. Administrative strategy 3 is to increase the annual licensing to cover the program's administrative costs. One of the things we learned was that, you know, there's it's an administrative burden for this program in terms of being able to assess the fees and keep up with them. This is one way that you could do that, increase the fee to fully cover the administrative cost of the program so that those costs are the responsibility of the property owners, the STR property owners, as opposed to taxpayers.
Administrative strategy 4 is to expand the use of HMIS and use the data to make informed decisions to address homelessness. In our analysis, we noticed that there is a need to have all homeless service providers, regardless of the funding sources they may receive, enter data into HMIS and fill their beds utilizing the coordinated entry system. This would allow the community to better understand the full continuum of services you have available, identify gaps in any services, any possible duplications in services, and address any barriers for accessing homeless services. HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, or SNAP, recommends that communities really analyze their data both at the system and the project level. And it helps you with evaluating across subpopulations and project types and in other ways. Administrative strategy number 5 is to right-size the current homeless services inventory. There's a need for permanent housing that's affordable to the lowest income households in Waco. The solution to homelessness is permanent housing. Over 60% of the households that were assessed through coordinated entry when we did our analysis were prioritized for a program called rapid rehousing. And in that type of a program, in order to move people quickly out of homelessness and into permanent housing, there needs to be available and affordable units. So maximizing your permanent supportive housing units for persons who need high levels of support is another part of this strategy. The current permanent supportive housing units are largely for chronically homeless veterans, while there are chronically homeless individuals who don't necessarily qualify for these types of units. The next part of this is that there's a need to evaluate the use of transitional housing beds. Some may be used as emergency shelters, and some may be used as just transitional. So many of the transitional housing providers might have the capacity to meet some of the needs in the community. However, it may require discussions about reducing the requirements to accessing some of these beds. So now we're moving into the supply part of our framework here. So the supply strategy number 1 is to increase investment in short-term rental assistance and homeless prevention. Again, while we were doing our analysis of coordinated entry, the second most frequently prioritized score was for diversion or mainstream services. These are often for households who are not literally homeless, but might be facing a housing crisis and need some rental assistance and utility assistance. Often they have the opportunity to remain in their current housing situation. And homeless prevention programs can be used to help people stabilize in housing. You could do case management, landlord mediation, financial assistance, and some housing location services to really help divert households from having to enter the homeless system altogether. Providing short-term shallow subsidies and case managements, they might be able to stabilize in their current housing.
So again, staying on the supply side, develop a citywide vacant property plan. So this speaks directly to the large supply of vacant properties that are out of the housing market and are not being neither rented nor owned and unavailable for occupancy. So the city currently has a list of about 5,000 vacant properties So our recommendation is to determine the owner of record and the availability for purchase. But really the crux of this would be to establish a vacant property registration ordinance that requires all owners of vacant structures to register their properties. And in Texas, Dallas, Arlington, Baytown, San Antonio all have such ordinances. And really it's a way to be able to raise, in one respect, raise fees to account for the administrative costs that the city might be incurring in terms of whether it's mowing grass or responding to nuisance calls that occur at vacant properties, but placing the responsibility of managing that program on the property owners of these vacant properties as opposed to taxpayers. There's also the possibility too of if the city is able to acquire vacant parcels, especially adjacent vacant parcels, packaging them for new development. And we've learned that the city has already acquired 15 vacant parcels on 15th Street and is continuing to strategically acquire parcels as available. So this is one way. This is a rather aggressive strategy, but one that can remove the nuisance properties, especially in neighborhoods where there's several on a block, where there's a core group of vacant properties, and trying to either put them back into the housing inventory through rehab and resale, or simply demolishing them if they're unfit for, really not feasible for rehabilitation, but trying to redevelop the land for new housing for residents. The next strategy involves amending the zoning ordinance to allow for higher density housing. So in Waco, 63% of the housing inventory is single-family units, and what's called upzoning, meaning increasing the zoning designation to allow for a higher density in accessible and higher opportunity locations to incentivize more multifamily housing. So permitting accessory dwelling units, for example, on residential lots is one way in single-family units. These tend to be smaller units than the principal lot of record, where either extended family members, such as elderly members, or even renting them out to non-family residents, it's still quite frequently a lower-cost housing option. But in terms of being able to facilitate an expansion of your housing supply at the upper end of the market, providing density bonuses. So that could mean increasing the density, reducing height limits, so additional floors could be added to multifamily housing, reducing other restrictions that would make it more feasible, maybe even increase the return on investment for the developers. So at the bottom of the slide, you'll see there's two sketches. So the purple apartment structure on the left is built according to zoning code, not Waco's, but it's just an example. And then when we say provide a density bonus, an example of that is eliminating the height restriction, so that in the case of the building on the right, that additional green floor is a bonus height, an additional floor that the developer has the right to build. And then where you see the 3 white units, in exchange for allowing a higher density for that particular building, then the developer agrees to provide 3 of those units as affordable. And when you have this type of a provision, then it's really up to the city to decide at what income level those units are affordable. Is it below 50%? Is it 50 to 80? Is it even 80 to 120% if you're looking at what we call workforce housing?
Say those percentages again, please.
I'm sorry?
Say those percentages again.
It's the income limit, so it's up to you to decide, it's up to the city to decide if you want those units affordable to 0 to 30, 30 to 50, whatever, you know, maybe in the income range that you need more units. So now we're moving into stability strategies that we're recommending. And the first one was an obvious one to us. You know, a community cannot build its way out of an affordable housing problem. And so by providing a requirement for the economic incentives you give to employers to create new jobs at $15 an hour minimum wage is one of those ways that you can increase the disposable income that a household has. $15 an hour is equivalent to about $30,000, about 75% of Waco's median income. Again, you know, the fact that the city has now raised its minimum wage for all city jobs to $15 an hour is certainly commendable. We've not worked in a city, in a community where that's been done before, so it certainly opens up more housing options in terms of being able to afford rent and even become homeowners. The next strategy is we're recommending that the city seek the designation of neighborhood revitalization strategy areas. This is a HUD designation, and it's associated with your community development block grant program. And the benefit overall is that going through the planning process and identifying the area where you want to basically locate this designation in a geographic area, it allows the city to benefit from the easing of some of the CDBG regulatory requirements. So this area is typically found where you have higher poverty residents at the block group level. Sometimes you can go up to the census tract level, and where it's primarily residential. But some of the things that the city can benefit from is, you know, when you go through your budgeting process for your community development block grant fund, you're limited to 15% of that total amount for public services. But in an NRSA, any funds that are allocated for public service activities do not fall under that cap. So maybe it's childcare services or some other need that's identified in that NRSA. You also do not have to provide the same level of detailed job creation tracking for economic development activities. And there's also an interesting benefit here, which is referred to as the aggregation of housing units. So if you have a neighborhood and you identify, for example, 100 housing units for rehabilitation, only 51% of those housing units need to be affordable to 51% and lower, which is the, you know, when you're dealing with the CDBG program, your beneficiaries have to be lower than 51% low and moderate income. But in the case of an NRSA, 49% of those housing units that you're going to rehab could be above 51%. And in a lot of cases, these are still going to be low-income homeowners, but in some cases, you might have other folks that want to move in and into the neighborhood and fill those vacant units that are now can be rehabilitated. So it is an opportunity to economically integrate a neighborhood. We've identified 2 areas that we think would be possible as good NRSA for NRSA consideration. One is the Bridge Street neighborhood in East Waco. And I should say too that when you're looking where to identify and locate these NRSAs, it's a really good practice to look for where other major capital improvements or investment areas, investment projects are already occurring, and sort of build off of that, that revitalization. So Bridge Street in East Waco would be a revitalization-focused NRSA. but also around the Magnolia Market, where the preservation of existing affordable housing around that area could be considered at risk due to more development in that area. So that would be a preservation-focused NRSA, we believe.
Is there, around is somewhat ambiguous. I mean, do we know a specific area? Because, I mean, you've got, to one side you have downtown, you know, I mean, what are we speaking about specifically? Are we talking about 8th Street back to maybe 15? I mean, what, around, I'm sorry, I need.
No, that's okay. So the first thing, before answering that, the first thing we want to do is just look specifically at which block groups, census block groups in that area meet that criteria.
Got you. Okay.
And then based on that, identify the ones that are contiguous and maybe closest, and those that are at risk, at greatest risk for, being displaced, or the properties being acquired for other new investment. Basically looking to preserve affordable housing in those areas.
Gotcha.
That would be an example of an anti-displacement initiative.
Thank you.
The next is to expand housing rehabilitation programs to increase production and focus on targeted city blocks. So when you look at the core of the core central area of Waco, and in the market types, there were a lot of neighborhoods where, we said older housing stock, oldest housing stock, in need of housing rehabilitation. In addition to that, the idea, the presence of such a large vacant housing supply across the city. It's a lot, and to have the resources to do all of that is not possible, nor is that feasible. So basically, looking to target your resources in smaller areas, so in city blocks where you can have a greater impact, where you're investing your funds. So whether it's in the NRSA and then outside of that area. But also, we're going to, toward the end of the presentation, we talk about strategic investment areas. So, for example, where the Floyd Casey redevelopment project is occurring, around that area, there are some neighborhoods that could benefit from housing rehabilitation as well, just to stabilize those as part of your naturally occurring affordable housing. So that's really what we're focusing here on. But again, this speaks to that very first recommendation to build a robust community services department so that you have the staffing capacity to ramp up an increased number of rehabilitations that are completed each year. One of the things that we wanted to point out too was that recently in Philadelphia they conducted a study that showed city-funded rehabilitation activities in historically segregated low-income Black and Hispanic neighborhoods help to decrease crime on that block. And so that's another incentive for identifying areas and really targeting where the rehabilitation should be occurring.
And that rehabilitation done in Philadelphia was inclusive of its current occupants, so it's kind of with, not to.
It's for owner-occupied households,
gotcha.
correct?
So they added, and I guess that's the pride in neighborhood. Is that where that's the assumption that's what led to the decrease in crime?
That I can't speak to. I couldn't answer you honestly on that one, but I will tell you that what they noted was that it was major structural repairs that were made to the house, not just like a coat of paint or something that was visible, but really something that improved the overall interior quality of the house and sustained it over a longer period of time. So this strategy is another one of those that will require a significant capacity as well. Establishing a rental registration program. So there's lots of benefits to this type of initiative. And it's also something that would, require establishing a fee so that the administrative cost of the program are borne by the rental property owners, not by, taxpayers in general. But by having an inventory and requiring all rental property owners to register and having that inventory of those properties, then it does give code inspectors authority to inspect a unit on a rotating basis, typically once every 3 to 5 years. And that range is from the different ordinances, but I think you can set your own. So it provides a greater level of protection for tenants, but I think what's really is one of the benefits of such a program that's often sort of drowned out when you have rental registration programs up, the ordinance, the enabling legislation up for a vote before an elected body, is that this type of a program can catch the code violations before they become so expensive then that the house really should not be even inhabited. And it deters code violations among property owners who might otherwise just continue to defer regular maintenance. But I think what's really important here is that for a lot of renters who might be hesitant to complain about the quality of their unit, whether it's a single mother or a single with children, or even a single female who does not want to risk, for example, eviction or retaliation because they were the ones who reported the violations, as well as individuals who might not be here legally but are renting. This takes the onus off of them to report the violations and then maybe be held responsible by the landowner for causing them additional investment in the properties to make them, bring them up to code.
Has this strategy been somewhat successful in other municipalities?
Yes, so in terms of Texas, these communities have rental registration programs. Dallas, Missouri City, Austin, College Station. Most of your college towns will have them. More likely you're going to find them in your college towns, but also in other areas where there's just a need for a greater maintenance, as well as sustainability of the rental housing stock, and putting that onus on the rental property owners, and not necessarily the city.
Right. I mean, I understand the college towns. However, there are a lot of cities that just have a lot of slumlords and really bad management. And we are unfortunately one of those cities that have a lot of owners who do not maintain their properties. And there's no real way outside of, a registration program to do, combat that. So, yeah.
And this is one of those strategies that really speak to preserving the affordable housing stock you already have in place. It's more cost effective, especially if your fees cover your administrative costs here, but it's more cost effective to preserve your existing affordable housing stock than to build new, whether you're talking about the private or the public markets. So this is a stability strategy where the city would be would have to be very assertive in identifying these properties. So NOAA properties, these are the naturally occurring affordable housing. Specifically, this strategy is referring to rental housing. So these structures are going to be the ones that or maybe your smaller rental properties, so 6 units, 8 units, 10, 12 units. Older housing, older structures that really have not been maintained and especially in terms of keeping them current in their amenities that they offer. But really going out and looking to identify these NOAA properties that are for sale and located in and close to gentrifying neighborhoods, and acquiring them for affordable housing provide financing to rehabilitate the units. The financing can come from, for example, the Housing Trust Fund. There could be some nonprofit organizations that can acquire these and then be the management agent for them. But this is quite frequently some really good housing stock. It was built some time ago, but for the city to acquire it with funds and then preserve it as affordable housing is a good way to preserve that older housing stock. The rents that you're going to be able to achieve from properties like this are probably most likely still going to be in the more affordable ranges than very new apartment units that are built today. And it also protects these from being converted to market rate housing, especially if they're in the pathway of other gentrifying initiatives or actions that are going on in some of the neighborhoods. It's one way to, again, help to prevent anti-displacement of renters in a neighborhood. Your home ARP funds, which are different than your ARPA funds, that would be an eligible activity as well. All right, so in terms of subsidy, we're going to revisit again the local housing trust fund. So this goes into a little bit more detail about the local, a local housing trust fund. And what I'm going to do is advance it to one slide because I think this slide explains it in a way better than just looking at the text. So in order to create the Housing Trust Fund, Waco City Council would have to adopt an enabling legislation that would establish the trust fund. In that ordinance, you would also identify who should be appointed to the Housing Trust Fund Board, not by name, but by expertise. So, for example, an attorney who is, with an understanding of either housing or land use law, a banker, a realtor, and other, bring a variety of experts from your local community to serve on this Housing Trust Fund. And then begin that capitalization, meaning begin trying to identify resources to fund it. So then you have this Housing Trust Fund Board, which is a nonprofit board that establishes the program guidelines. So within that enabling legislation, the City Council is going to say, we want only households up to 100% of AMI to benefit from this program. Okay, so that means that no one higher can, but you also can, the Housing Trust Fund Board can also say how it's going to provide housing assistance and benefit those individuals and households. So is it going to be through the construction of new affordable rental housing? Is it going to be with a home buyer assistance program? Whatever those programs are that have been identified as a need in Waco, all of that would be within those program guidelines. And the Housing Trust Fund Board would also have to hire staff. And then, in a very simple way, this is basically the cycle that happens on an annual basis. Or in some cases, Housing Trust Fund boards just have a rolling cycle where they take applications constantly as long as there's funding available. So they would issue a notice of funding availability to finance eligible activities according to their program guidelines. And then they award these funds to selected projects. The projects are developed. And in the case where there are loans made, not grants, but loans made by the Housing Trust Fund, then any loans that are repaid go back into the Housing Trust Fund. But at the same time, there is a need to continue to seek funding sources on a regular basis, especially if there is not a dedicated stream of revenue that can be designated strictly for the Housing Trust Fund in this case. So, your your American Rescue Plan resources that you're receiving, that would be an eligible use. Local foundations, and as we discussed previously, any proceeds from the sale of city-owned assets. So if there are any properties within the trust, the city's trust for land, anything else that the city, land and or structures that the city sells could be dedicated to providing financing to the Housing Trust Fund Board, as well as allocations made from general fund. The next strategy is to facilitate the establishment of a community land trust. So this is very different from a housing trust fund. A housing trust fund is primarily, think of it as sort of the city's only private sort of bank. It's strictly for lending for housing related activities. But a community land trust is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to acquire and take receipt of property, specifically land, that's held in trust for the development of new affordable housing. So what happens in this case is that the community land trust acquires property and they decide to build, for example, five single family units on an acre of land somewhere. They find income eligible buyers for those properties that they built. But those home buyers are only buying the home. The land on which that house sits remains in ownership. It's held in trust by that community land trust. And what this does is it removes the land acquisition cost from the cost of buying the home. So this works really well in college towns with a large population of students, so large universities. But it also works well within neighborhoods of a city where there might be benefit to acquiring land, whether it's in close proximity to, for example, a transit stop or major employers. That's also an option there. Any tax foreclosed properties held in trust by the city could be transferred to a community land trust, and in a community land trust can then apply to the Housing Trust Fund for funds to build their housing. So there is a relationship between the two, but they are very different. This is the final strategy. So we would recommend that the city consider expanding the rental tax abatement program to include multifamily properties as well. So incentivize with 10-year tax abatement for the development of affordable multifamily projects, primarily 5 units or more, or adaptive reuse or preservation of formerly vacant or non-residential structures. So any large industrial buildings or schools, actually, that usually the floor plan of which really lends themselves nicely to small apartment units. And in exchange for this, this tax abatement, receiving that tax abatement, the city could also get the property owner to keep the rents lower during that tax abatement period. So now we're going to move into, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say, so we heard a lot about the strategies that we've provided to you, but we also want to take the next step and say, okay, given all these strategies, where can we deploy these? And so what we did is we looked at strategic investment areas across the city.
Let me stop really quick there. Sorry about that. We're coming up on 2 hours. How much longer do you think it's going to be to get to
I can make this pretty quick. There's about four more slides, and I can go through these pretty quickly.
Okay, we'll go 10 more minutes. We can do that.
I'll go through quickly. And so we focused on areas where there's development already occurring within the city. And Marjorie and I both drove through the city, looked at these areas, took that into account discussions we've had with stakeholders as well as the statistics. So if you go to the next slide. So we're recommending, as you can see, really taking advantage of your residential tax increment zones, and they're found in all market types. And these, as you can see on these, this overlay as they relate to the market types. They are found in, most of these are in the central core of Waco. And these benefits of the tax incremental residential zones can spur additional new investment. It's already starting in some of these neighborhoods, as you well know. And then so we've highlighted these investment areas on the following slides, more detailed. So the first area that we really looked at is the Lasalle area corridor, and that's for a number of reasons. It's potential area of focus in the future for the city planning department in terms of revitalization. We, on the far end of the site, the Waco Housing Authority is already carrying out a RAD improvement program of their public housing at South Terrace Apartments. So you could build on the current investment that's currently going on there. There's significant potential for affordable housing development on vacant land between 7th and 9th Streets and Hines Avenue and Gurley Avenue. And a need for an infill between Oakwood and Primrose Avenue, given the abundance of vacant parcels. This is really a good strategy area to start focusing on, given its proximity to Baylor and all the additional potential development that could occur. I would also recommend really working with developers to encourage mixed use and mixed income multifamily developments along this corridor on either side of LaSalle Street, again, to take advantage of what's currently going on related to the current investment that's currently going on there and really preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. As we stated earlier, East Waco Carver, this is really a focus area as well. There's a lot of potential opportunity, as you well know. We're talking about preserving land and affordable housing stock between Live Oak, Chestnut Street, Garrison, Preston. You really have an opportunity to prepare a comprehensive redevelopment plan for the former Paul Quinn College site and the recently acquired Doris Miller YMCA. We think that presents the city a huge opportunity to provide additional affordable housing on that site to some extent, and as well as preserving land and affordable housing near there. We would recommend providing incentives to assist with the establishment of an acquisition rehab or new construction resale homeownership program for income targets between 1,500 and 20% of area median. Again, in this area, also opportunity to partner with the Waco Housing Authority for a latter RAD phase at the Stella Maxi public housing site. That is a future RAD site in which they hope to revitalize and again, working in partnership with not just the public housing site, but in and around that neighborhood to preserve affordable housing for households up to 80% of area median. And then design and implement a weatherization program for homeowners up to 80% to reduce the cost burden related to utility costs in this area. This is another opportunity that you well know. It's the former Stanger elementary school site. We understand that there's architectural schematic plan completed for this that will allow for 20 market rate and 6 affordable housing units to be developed. We recommend, preparing a financial feasibility analysis with projected sources and uses funds to complete this project, and really to conduct a phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessment related to the reports to determine if any environmental remediation is necessary. And just a reminder that public funding can be used to clean the site in order to prepare and convey it to a developer if needed. This would also we would also suggest targeting housing rehabilitation and funding for the surrounding neighborhood, and really partnering to do this with grassroots CDC to carry out some of these initiatives. And then finally, the former Hillcrest Hospital site along Herring Avenue really presents another opportunity for this 14-acre site to be developed. Redevelopment plans are currently unknown, and the City Council, you recently approved a taxed residential incentive for this site, and really using that as a vehicle for potential high-density, mixed-use, mixed-income development. It's a pretty stable part of the city that would really work well there. As part of the Transitions negotiate with the property owner, we should include an affordable housing set aside within an overall development plan. And then the Kate Ross, again, this would be another Waco Housing Authority partnership. Their third phase would be the Kate Ross Public Housing Site. Given its location near the silos in Baylor, really should focus on preserving long-term affordability of any new units constructed or rehabbed in this area. And it should be, any redevelopment plan should be comprehensive in nature and expand beyond the public housing site into the surrounding neighborhood. Again, redevelopment should focus on both rental and for sales housing for up to 80% of median income. I think this would be the last one. This is the former Floyd Casey site. We understand that it's already under redevelopment, but if possible, try to ensure at least a portion of these units are set aside for low moderate income households as part of the tax residential zone designation in exchange for providing public financing for infrastructure if necessary. There's a real opportunity given the prospect of 300 new housing units that at least 20% of those should be set aside for affordable market or for affordable units after the initial market rate units have been sold. We would highly recommend begin negotiating with the developer on this development on an MOU that outlines terms, conditions, and timeline for the construction of affordable housing units. It's a real opportunity to get some additional and sorely needed affordable housing in the city on that site. And then again, focus housing rehab around that targeted neighborhood as the redevelopment of that site goes on.
Mayor, before we get into the next steps, would you all want to consider about a 5-10 minute break?
Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene at 3:10. Thanks.
Kidding, but not really.
Just kidding. All right, I think that y'all are just getting to the next steps.
Okay, Mayor and Council, I'll be following up with the next steps regarding the presentation. We've heard about the silver bullet for the last couple of hours, so now we're going to talk about targets.
I loved it.
So in this presentation, we'll be discussing proposed programs and timelines for implementation of our federal poverty guidelines and qualified census tracts that have been defined by the American Rescue Plan Act. And lastly, we'll talk about the needs to implement and the next steps. Okay. So we heard a lot of information this afternoon regarding different recommendations from administrative strategies to supply strategies, stability strategies, and subsidy strategies identified in the draft plan. The question that we're all probably asking now is, how do we implement and where do we start? In addition to, what role do I play in the implementation process? Staff has begun to develop what we call a roadmap to community preservation. The different pillars shown here are financial stability, housing affordability, and our housing stock. Within each of these pillars, you will see activities that tie back to the strategies mentioned in the previous presentation by Mullen and Lonergan. First thing we'll discuss is financial stability. This is a key component to the other two pillars. As we've discussed on numerous occasions, the key to affordable housing is earning power. Down payment assistance can help you get into a home, but your earnings determine your ability to afford the house long term. We have already invested in the upskill program and plan to invest into additional job training activities. Thanks to our city council, the city as an employer has implemented stability strategy number 1, as mentioned in the presentation, where all city jobs start at a minimum pay of $15 an hour. In addition, the city is looking to expand the small business program. We previously allocated funding in our CDBG grant for the small business education, and we'll be reissuing an RFP in the near future for this. In addition, we plan to recapitalize the small business grant program and provide additional seed money for the loan program in relation to small businesses. This is all geared towards financial stability of our Waco residents. Next, we'll be discussing housing affordability. We're looking to expand our home ownership program, which we believe can be accomplished in year one. This will aid individuals in our households who are above our income guidelines of who we normally serve under our entitlement programs. It will help provide gap financing for individuals or households who have higher incomes, providing them with more options, thereby encouraging them from buying down. As we talked about earlier, the housing mismatch. Well, by being able to provide the down payment assistance to those that are above our normal 80% threshold, that'll take individuals out of competition with our lower income households for the same units. Expanding our TBRA program is another strategy under our housing affordability. This is to support supply strategy number 1 identified in the previous presentation. This will provide additional assistance with the ability to serve more households, which will result in housing stabilization and ultimately preventing homelessness. Expansion of the home buyer counseling in our IDA program is an administrative strategy we plan to implement. The goal is to build a robust education counseling program to increase the number of individuals or households who are ready for home ownership. The program will outline a plan for each household to work through and execute with the ultimate goal of home ownership. The participants will be encouraged to save as part of the program and can receive matching funds towards down payment assistance for their home purchase. This is a program that we previously partnered with Grassroots with over the last couple of years. So we're looking to take a pause on the program and relaunch with an expanding it to include those in the higher income brackets as well. The final pillar we wanted to look at is our housing stock. The expansion of the rehab and lead programs is to do exactly what the strategy suggests, preserving our existing housing stock and encouraging those homes in the surrounding areas to rehab their homes. Currently, our programs are capped based on income limits. With our increased investment, this will allow us to offer assistance to individuals above our current income limits. Long term, the focus is to expand to offer a rental rehab program. We can assist rental units under our lead program, but are limited in the scope of work we can provide and the income governed by income limits in our current program as well. So the rental rehab program will provide additional capital for preserving units and serve as a tool to help create more affordable rental units. Exploring the implementation of a housing trust fund and a community land trust is a direct result of subsidy strategies 1 and 2. This can be a mechanism to acquire land to ensure affordability and provide low-cost financing options. Financing can be provided as a combination of grants and/or loans for single-family and multifamily housing development and rehab. This will help with the development throughout the city. The timeline that you see here has been included to provide you a visual of when we anticipate these programs being established and or implemented. The primary funding source at this time for these programs are our ARP dollars, which we have dedicated about $11 million towards housing, which was identified as our biggest priority in the citizen engagement tool. I've included the deadlines regarding the ARP funding along the timeline, so you'll see the commitment of ARP dollars must be committed by December of 2024, and the spending deadline is December of 2026. Staff will be coming back to council with a series of presentations as we develop program designs, policies, and procedures. The first program we plan to begin with will be the expansion of our down payment assistance and rehabilitation programs. We plan to bring these back to you in February, followed by community engagement to let the community know these programs and the policies, programs, and procedures associated with these programs. We will do this for each subsequent program as those are developed and established. As I mentioned previously, the primary financing tool for these initiatives currently is our ARP fund. Final guidance was just released on last week that outlined the income guidelines for assistance. Funds can be used to assist households that earn up to 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. So for a family of 4, that household could earn up to $79,500 if assistance is being provided based on the income levels. Households can also qualify for assistance if they're residing in a qualified census tract. I've included a map of the qualified census tracts located within the Waco city limits. Staff is currently reviewing the final rules to ensure that we can maximize the number of individuals and households that we can assist based on the information of the final rule. So how do we make this program a success? First thing we would like to look at is establishing a formal housing policy. This will be a single source document that will provide a foundation outline for all the housing programs offered by the city. Now, this document will be considered a working document because as times change and rules and different needs change, we will need to go in and update the policy accordingly based on the needs that are the current needs identified. We have some resources allocated already to implement some of the program initiatives that I discussed. In addition, some of the recommended strategies, such as the rental registration program, were mentioned during the budget process. The inclusion of multifamily properties as part of the residential tax abatement area is another option council may wish to explore. If you recall, in June of 2021, council did approve modifications to the current RTA policy to include rental units from a duplex, townhome, and single-family perspective. We will explore expanding our current policy to include multi-family units if that is the desire of the council. And all of this collaboration is key. Each of us here today, and some that are not here today, will all play a part in the success of the plan. For example, while not mentioned in the chart, title clearance will be a key part of the overall initiatives, which is something that will look to be carried out by one of our community partners. With the vast amount of needs and housing inventory, it is going to require a long-term commitment from all resources to achieve these goals. It will also require creativity and flexibility to get these things accomplished. We will begin exploring different mechanisms to help facilitate development, such as a public facility corporation, looking at modifications to our current tax credit policies, and how the Housing Finance Corporation can assist with some of this development, all with the ultimate goal of preserving our community. And so with that, I will answer any questions.
Thank you, guys. Thanks. I want to start by saying thanks to our staff, Renisha, Galen, Deidre, and the entire City of Waco, Bradley, Jennifer, our entire City of Waco team. Thanks for everyone's hard work on this, and to our consultants as well. You know, we've had a joke about this being silver bullet because there's been a lot of build up to this housing study coming out, but we know there's no silver bullets, and I do like the spin on that Galen gave with the target. But I just can't thank our staff's appreciation enough, and I also want to thank all the community members that are here now, or I saw a couple trickle in and trickle out, and I appreciate everyone who is here today on behalf of our community As Galen mentioned, this is going to take a collaboration. I want to thank the Cooper Foundation for helping fund this. And I see Felicia here today. Thank you so much, because that is a perfect picture of what it's going to take for us to really accomplish the housing goals that we have. It's a team effort for us to get done what we need to get done. So thankful for our staff and our community team who's here today. I know this is something that this council values incredibly highly. Councilmember Rodriguez couldn't be here, and Councilmember Borderood had to leave, but this is something that we hear from our community members regularly. I think workforce and housing are the two issues that I personally hear more than any other subject matter, and it's incredibly important to us as we grow as a community and become more desirable and attractive as a community, to make sure that we're thoughtful about our housing strategies. So I have a lot of questions and comments, but I'm going to turn it over to our council and to let them kick it off with some questions or comments that we might have.
I just got some comments. Thank Galen, great presentation, and also, yeah, great presentation here on this has been a front and center issue for the city as we have a level of prosperity here in the city. We want to make sure it goes all the way across all elements of the community, and we have some affordable housing issues, so we're looking for help, and I appreciate the work that we've done on the work that you guys have done on giving us some perspective and some data to build from. I like the action time, or just some of the ideas on tax abatement, the housing trust fund, the community land trust. Those sound interesting. The rental registration, the vacant property plan. Some of this seems almost parts of it are administrative. Parts of it will require some funding and some evaluation of the return on investment. But it's not, to me, it's not purely dollar on dollar, because there's so much collateral benefit we get from having a healthy housing stock in Waco. And as I was trying to reconcile early in the presentation, this is the stock, and this is you pointed out there's a bit of a mismatch, really, as you go from a group to group and AMI to AMI. So that's really part of what we're trying to address here too. And Galen, I think you're right on point on getting the financial stability, the housing affordability, and housing stock. And particularly, we didn't talk a lot about it today, but you kind of wrapped it into one of the action items, Galen, on just rehabbing what we have, because a lot of the housing stock in Waco, in my neighborhood, in all of our neighborhoods, is approaching 100 years old in a lot of places, and there's still good housing, but we got to be thinking about how we rehab those houses. So establishing that rehab source will be important. And again, I like how you summarize how to make this a success, Galen, and with the formal housing policy, resources, again, as the mayor said, it's a good little turnout here with all the different groups that we will need to make this a success. We need the collaboration of the community and the community agencies to make this thing work. And again, a long-term commitment, as you mentioned, Galen, and creativity and flexibility. I like the data that we got today and kind of the direction I think this council wants to go to make this a success. So again, I appreciate the presentation and look forward to next steps.
Thank you again to everybody that has had a pivotal role in creating this. We have waited on a lot of decisions up on this council for us to be able to make data-informed, evidence-based decisions. And so I think this presentation and the report that you give us will be incredibly helpful in us being able to point through. These are the legislative decisions we need to have, and this is the way this needs to be manifest through our ordinances. These are the funding priorities that we need to take. These are the programs we need to expand, the staff we need to expand, the new programs we need to create. I think as a social worker sitting up here, none of this data is surprising, but it is nonetheless deeply alarming. I, in paying attention to my body throughout this conversation, just felt deep sadness and rage sit in my body hearing that a third of our residents are making only $25,000 a year, that so many of our residents living below, well below our area median income are having to work multiple jobs, over 40 hours a week. We know that so many of these jobs are frontline jobs, so their level of exposure to COVID-19 is through the roof, and we know that just the ways that intersecting identities of race and class and gender and disability compound on top of all of these things. So I feel a deep sadness bearing witness to all of this today. One of the things that comes up for me is recognizing that these are systemic issues that are deeply interconnected. I appreciated the consultant's comment of we can't build our way out of this. We have to have things like living wage jobs, and to have living wage jobs, we have to have access to get there through public transportation. We have to have affordable quality childcare that we can put our children into. Something that came up for me also is thinking about our role in WEDMEC, and I think it's incredibly important that we committed as a council and as city staff to create a $15 an hour minimum wage for our city staff. That is a huge win. But knowing that $15 is that baseline when we are incentivizing big businesses, I think it's time that we consider changing that dollar amount to closer to $20 an hour. I want us to be a part of really moving the needle, and if that $15 an hour is still at 75% of our AMI, that feels like we are addressing the problem, but we're not going as aggressively as we need to. And what I hear in this presentation is this needs to be aggressive, this needs to be evidence-based, this needs to be multi-pronged. One of the questions I have for every single person in this room and for folks that are watching online is, what is my unique role to play in addressing housing? How can I, through my faith community, through my neighborhood, through my workplace, be a part of filling this? Because like Mayor said, we can't do this as a six of us by ourselves. Our incredibly dedicated housing groups can't do this. Our homeless coalition, our Chodo partners, this is way too heavy for one individual or one entity to bear. So how do we all take radical responsibility in this moment and know the only way forward is by us all coming to the table and being willing to try new things. I'm excited in this moment. I'm excited to see how we go forward, how we create general fund allocations. I think this is a big piece for me. When we were looking at the FY 2021-22 budget, there was some hesitation on council's part to increase our general fund allocation until we saw these dollars. And now that we're seeing how great the need is, I'd love to see an aggressive allocation of general fund dollars towards this. And I think it needs to be in the millions of dollars. And how do we have our foundation partners and the private sector through corporate responsibility also play a piece in this, because this is years and years of divestment from the core of the city, so it's going to take a collaborative effort to move us forward. So I could talk about this forever, but pass it off to the rest of the dais.
Thank you all again, staff, and for your extreme dedication to this and to hearing the requests of this council and this body of how we move forward to advance Wacoans. I'll echo a great deal of my council members' statements, and probably the first thing that rang true to me is that there are so many participants in this process that, you know, there is no one person who can be responsible for this. It has to be us all. And I'm ever appreciative for our community partners who are in this room. Because, fun facts, if you didn't know, you stand in commitment to this process with your presence. Appreciate you. You know, the other part in our responsibility in this is because we have the due diligence to set that policy. And as we set it, you know, it is up to us to make sure there are no unintended consequences that can come in the future of writing what this looks like, because it's not just us. These are those trees that we plant we won't sit under. So I'm excited to make sure and to look and to hear in our community engagement piece what that will feel like for, you know, the grandchildren or the, you know, the great grandchildren that will be walking into better generational circumstances than we sit at here. I'm really excited about utilizing things that we've, you know, the legacy that came before us is already set. You know, you have the Heart of Texas Finance Corporation. How about we use it? Yep. And I think that's awesome that has been integrated into this. And so it'll also offer more of an educational opportunity for Wacoans to see what it is that we have in our toolbox. And, you know, I know that this is going to take some very creative financing from our city manager and staff, because it's looking like the community services department is going to have to expand a bit. And, you know, those are those things that I believe, as Councilmember Palmer mentioned, that, you know, as we have and utilize this manna money, you know, we have an opportunity to hit some things really hard that don't have to be sustained, but we will have to find those answers within our budget on how we sustain what it is that we're asking for. What we say we want, we have to figure out how we sustain that, and that's our responsibility also. But really breathless. So, you know, what the other parts, I will have, I know I'm in this slide, I thank the city secretary's office, because I was like, no, I need some paper to go along with this, because I have to write the notes exactly on the things, because I won't remember what they were. And I have several questions that I would like to, or ask if staff would consider maybe meeting with us offline to go through, because we'd be here forever if we wanted to do it that way. And I would appreciate a greater opportunity to do that. But this is a wonderful stepping point where we are. There's some things that, you know, as Councilmember Palmer mentioned, that we have included that weren't, you know, maybe directly reflected in the documentation. Not only our city's incentive of increased minimum wage, but that we did change how we incentivize corporations into coming into this city to be reflective of that also. And so we've made that step, and it has been kind of important to us for a long time to see that happened, and it finally has. I know I troubled Millette for a long time when she would come and make presentations in her tenure as Economic Development Chair about the lower waged jobs, because we can't change what this looks like until we change what it feels like. And I'm gonna feel it in my pocket. So I have to do it in a way that will advance us further. And I mean, and for the least of us to the most of us. Lastly, what I'll say is the higher AMI numbers that are participating in down market purchases. That's the one thing that kind of is sitting with me. And, you know, so that's why I posed the question to you earlier about, is that normal that we have such a lack of number of units for those who can afford more? And I'm not, I mean, you know, I mean, people who have money keep money by saving money. I mean, you know, this is not something we don't know and understand. I don't have to buy what I can necessarily afford. However, I need to know in the commitment that we have to the education process. Where is it? You see all the notes in the pages. There was a mention of education, educational assistance for all earning groups. And so I think that that's something that is really going to be pivotal in this, because I may not know what I'm doing to those that make less than I do. It may not have any cognitive thought to me. So I think an opportunity to spread that and to educate on all levels, not just those who are lower income earning, because I've got to figure out how to buy this house and keep this house, you know, but those who are on my more advanced and higher earning incomes, what does it mean to me to step down 2 levels? How many people am I keeping from housing? So I'm super excited about that, and looking forward to how we circle up and wrap our arms around the least of these, especially those dealing in homeless and close to homelessness circles, because, you know, we all know 24 hours can change your life, and you can go from a certain home to nothing at all. So I look forward to all levels of this, and I am committed to walking this walk with everybody in this room.
Thank you, Council. I have a couple questions, and I'll take a cue from Councilmember Bearfield and reserve some of those for maybe a one-on-one conversation with some of our staff members for sake of time here. But one of the questions I have is global, and it's not to be answered now, and it's not to be answered by anybody on the panel today, but I think that a question that I have for the future for us to dig into is, I know based on data, there's a surplus of jobs that pay good wages, or at least more than $15 an hour in Waco. And talking to the Amazon plant manager, he's been like, I need warm bodies with no training to show up, and I'm going to pay them at least $18 to $20 an hour with full benefits, including health insurance and a 401k. And so I think there's a gap in my mind that I could make an assumption on, but I want to know the data or the reasoning why there's a disconnect between our citizens and the available jobs in our community right now. And I don't know what the exact answer to that. I could make a guess. I could make an assumption. Probably all of us in this room could make a guess or assumption and say what we think it is. But I'm really curious to know what that is. And I agree with Councilmember Palmer on the strategic components of perhaps childcare, transportation, or whatever it is that as a community at large, we need to be working to ensure that people have access to those jobs. And I celebrate Upscale Waco and all the work that is doing and rolling up our sleeves and the more work that needs to be done there. But I think that I want to start by acknowledging, like, we've got the jobs. We have an unprecedented number of vacant jobs in Waco that are paying good wages. And that is a starting point that I think is incredibly something to celebrate, but also valuable when we're thinking through housing. I think, as Galen said, earnings determine the ability to keep a home. And so really doubling down on that strategy, I think, is going to be incredibly important as we move forward. So yeah, I'm excited to kind of continue to extrapolate that work as a part of this and economic development in general. Another question I have is, what does healthy mixed income development look like? I mean, that is something that I want to know. What's the unit count for market versus affordable? What size multifamily units make healthy multifamily? When does it get too big? When is it better to have what's the right economies of scale and size? So what is a really healthy mixed income development is another question that I have as we move forward as well. I totally agree with what Councilmember Palmer said on the faith communities. I think faith communities is great. I think kind of just really signaling to our community, hey, this is an issue that we're facing. And so and I think as we move forward kind of as a community or city, ensuring that we know where to plug people in to this continuum is going to be an important part of it as well. I love the idea of like really building out a robust continuum on this. I like the idea of having a playbook, and I know you got to be nimble and be flexible, but having the idea of like this is where we're going. We got a playbook, and here's who's doing what and how we're going to do it is something that I'm excited for. And I want to pause right now and acknowledge there's a lot of great work happening in our community with regard to housing. So thank you to the people here, everyone out in the community doing good work on housing, everyone on our city staff doing good work on housing. Thank you for what you're doing. But I'm excited about bringing a little clarity to what we can do to really achieve some of these robust goals that are being outlined today.
Mayor?
Yes, ma'am.
Before you conclude, I didn't think about it, and I don't know that I heard it in these conversations. What data is available for like second chance housing for folks who are recently paroled, or and where that falls into these numbers? Because I know that there's some stipulations that are there as far regarding housing, and perhaps regarding renting for formerly incarcerated folks. And so I just wanted to maybe see if we could add that into a layer to study.
Yeah, I
My
agree.
apologies.
No, you're great. Things that I was really excited about hearing today was the land trust. I really like the idea of mixed income housing, and I don't know. I know that there's some developers that do this really well, and so how do we recruit those into our market or charge up our local developers on the opportunity for good mixed income development, and what does that look like? I love rehab. I like the idea of looking at how we rehabilitate housing stock because it hits so many check boxes of mine personally. One is, yes, we're taking care of families, but the other is from a tax-based perspective, and when I'm looking at city revenue that we're generating, we've got to secure our tax base too. And when we look at block after block of dilapidated housing stock, not only is that damaging for the families in this community, which it is, and I'm not diminishing that, but it's also problematic from a city revenue perspective, because to ensure that we have money for infrastructure and roads and streets and to pay our city employees, we've got to make sure that that we're not sending families to the edges of our city because the housing stock is in bad shape. And so being really thoughtful about how there's a return on investment, I think, to our community. There's a good ROI when you look at at rehab programs in the middle of our city or housing programs in the middle of our city. I think there's jobs that get created when you're looking at how you do construction in the middle of our city too. So really looking globally at the return on investment that's happening when we deploy housing strategies like this, I think is going to be important. But I'm really big on the rehab, and I'm excited for that because I think that it's going to really revitalize our core in a healthy way and in a community-minded way. I like the idea of packaging in the RFP. That's something I'm really excited about. I love what we did on 15th Street. I think that what the return on investment that our tax base is going to get from that makes it make sense, and it meets the need of providing good affordable housing. However we develop those lots. So I think that that's really exciting as well. I'm interested to hear about creative incentives that we can deploy. I like the economically integrated neighborhood strategies and want to hear more about that. I have a lot of questions about rental registration. I'm not saying it's bad. I really want to prohibit slumlords from happening, but I really just want to make sure that whoever on our city department is enforcing that is penalizing the right people and not penalizing good actors. And it becomes some burdensome thing to be a good landlord in Waco. So ensuring that we strike the right balance for that is going to be something that's important for me to see. Although I understand the benefit to the policy, I just want to make sure that the unintended consequences from that don't make the program less than what it could be. I have some, and again, this is a question that I can get with staff on later, but another question I have is, we have all the federal dollars that have come in for tenant assistance and rental assistance. And Councilmember Barefield brought this up just momentarily ago, like there's people that are excluded maybe per the rule. We've had a lot of money sitting there right now. That's like my understanding, or at least the county has a lot of money available to help with rental assistance. And so I think that I need to better understand the gap and again, not based on assumption or what I think might be like really understand why are people, when we're seeing people in the dire situations that we find them in, where's the gap with this pool of money that's available to the people that we want to be able to take that might take advantage of that. And again, I think there's specific reasons for that. I just want to see in writing. This is what we see come up repeatedly. I would also be curious to know if the federal tenant-based rental dollars that we have or that the county has can be used somehow to creatively, but very, very legally, obviously, fund some rehab. And so said otherwise is like, hey, you're gonna take the property from here to here if you fund it, but we're gonna provide you a tenant who is paying more in rent, but it's funded through this federal incentive program. I don't know if that'll work or not. It's just something creative that I think we'd love to see. Excited to deploy, as Councilmember Barefield brought up, the Heart of Texas Financing Corp. Strategically, I think, with these other trusts that we're looking at generating. And then the last thing that I would just note too is that one of the things that seems that got brought up was just the supply stock in the lack of supply in general. And I've heard members of every sector of our community discuss the issues with rising housing costs in Waco. And so I think that while our focus is, I think rightfully, on affordable housing in the core of our city, I want to just note that because housing that supply in general was referenced, I do wonder if the Development Services Office needs to be examined to make sure that they're staffed and resourced appropriately to make sure that housing across our community at large is growing in a healthy way, to make sure that those top brackets aren't having to dip down into the lower ones. And since we already have the infrastructure in our Development Services Department in place, just looking at that department too, to ensure that they've got everything they need and is working in conjunction with our Housing Department and Neighborhood Services Departments. So really excited about where we're going with this. I think it's going to have a really great return on investment to our communities at large, and really thankful for the time and effort that everyone put into this. Any other comments from council? Any comments from staff? All right. The next item on the agenda is the hearing of visitors. I do have a card. During the hearing of visitors section of the agenda, we will provide an opportunity for the public to present concerns or address issues that are not matters of well, this is actually listed on for this work session item. So we can talk about, if this is, Jennifer, this is the card that I have is actually on for to discuss the work session presentation. So we can, I don't need to go to the hearing of visitors yet. We can just call that person now, right? Okay. The first person I have to speak on this work session is Mr. Sean Lee. Hey, Sean.
Hey, how are you? I just want to start off by saying that I was really impressed by your presentation. I'm really excited to see how the City of Waco is going to move forward with this plan, and I just had a couple of comments and a couple of points from the homeless service sector. I really like the rental registration program. Just anecdotally, we have a lot of clients who are low income and are hesitant to confront their landlords about concerns that they might have with their unit. Oftentimes, if they are brought up, their leases aren't renewed, or they find reason to evict that client. And so I was not aware that this was something that was an option, and I think it's a wonderful idea. I did have a question about incentives for new building units. I do understand that oftentimes, as we were talking about here, there are incentives for builders to create new units with the expectation that a certain percentage of those are going to go to low-income individuals or sliding scale, something like that. But as far as what we've seen on the homeless services side is we've really had a difficult time accessing those units, and we have a coordinated entry system which prioritizes individuals who are seeking rental assistance or facing housing scarcity, and I'd really like to see if it was possible to kind of combine those two systems into an actionable plan. I want to add my voice to the chorus of a citywide increase of the minimum wage. That would obviously just increase the amount of housing that's available to a lot of our consumers here that we serve. Oftentimes, we want to serve individuals. They might technically be able to afford a unit, but landlords are requiring 3 times their rental amounts or 3 times the amount of their income. So that makes it very difficult for them. Bumping up a minimum wage to $15 an hour would be kind of an organic way of being able to increase the availability of housing to some of our low-income individuals. We are currently working on declaring the City of Waco as having 0 veteran homelessness. And I just want to show that as an example of if we really all come together as a community, tackling something as large as homelessness is possible. We're going to be doing it for veterans in our community, and so if we kind of pull all those resources together in the same way that we're doing for veterans, in the same way that I hope this plan will, I would like to see City of Waco be able to declare homelessness extinct for our community. That's all my comments. Thank you. Any questions for me?
I know. I'll just say I'm really optimistic that as a result of this, some of the continuum aspect of housing is going to be addressed to resolve some of those concerns you brought up. And Deidre and Bradley, I believe I'm right to say that we're going to have a presentation specifically on homelessness. I'm in a council meeting in a couple weeks, in the next couple months. Is that right?
That's correct.
Great. Yep. So I think there's going to be more discussion on that specific issue.
Awesome.
Related
Thank
to
you.
this. Thanks, Sean. Anyone else here to speak on the work session from today? That's great. Thanks, guys. All right. Well, then we'll move on to the next item, which is hearing of visitors. During the hearing of visitors section of the agenda, we provide an opportunity for the public to present concerns or address issues that are not matters of consideration on the agenda. Council is unable to conduct discussion but will listen, ask staff to look into concerns and provide follow-up. Please provide registration information so we can contact you. If you're unable to approach the podium, we can bring a microphone. Is there anyone here to speak at the hearing of visitors? If not, we'll close the hearing of visitors, and there being no further business, we will adjourn at 3:55 p.m.